Oh,
I am so sorry.
je ne sais pas. No, thank you.
What level of French is this? What? Dude, I am so sorry.
Yeah, this is the first time I've ever been relationship. I didn't think I didn't keep myself.
I was gonna say, wow, that's really
Wow.
Oh, yeah,
Okay.
just quick read to the team real quick. Just a quickie one.
You know the deal. Never keep you guys up for class.
I mean, Alex Romance is on the rocks right now.
Oh, that's a father, guys. What is one of my favorite romances?
Yes. I just turned in a rewrite of my book review and
We'll get this
got a B plus.
Yeah, so did mine.
Last,
What's your book review?
American Scripture.
Okay, yeah, sure. Enjoy the book. Any good thoughts on it?
It was really dry, really dense, so I had to read just enough to just squeeze out a book review. I have like 4 other classes, so.
There's nothing quite like having to just get through it.
Yeah.
Someday, if you guys want to talk about it, we can talk about the best ways to get around having to do the reading. We have to read a whole book. I can teach you guys the secret of reading a book,
Please
especially
tell
history
me.
books.
Please,
Literally just did a statement that I've been following for this class.
please.
Just trying to find a way to get.
So if you're ever, this is the secret. Here's the secret. How many of you all are history majors?
The Italian.
I'm going to give you the secret. Here's the secret. If you ever get assigned a history book and you don't have the whole time to read it, but you need to be able to discuss it in class, you read the entire introduction, the whole introduction, because every history book is constructed the same way. We all have to write the book the same way. Your introduction lays out your topic. It lays out the author's thesis, and then they go paragraph by paragraph telling you what they're going to do in the rest of the book. So once you've read the introduction, you read the first paragraph and the last paragraph of each chapter, and you'll have read the book. That's how I did grad school. I'm not sure I read a whole book in grad school.
Is that what you're encouraging us to do here?
No, I'm simply saying that if you ever have to shortcut a history book to do like a book review or discuss it in class,
I know what you're
that's
talking
all you
about.
need to
I
read.
can't remember exactly.
Thank you so much. I like.
I recommend only doing it as a shortcut when you're desperate, because you're supposed to be reading these things, but if you can't, if you get stuck.
To be honest,
Yeah.
if you take like any history class like that,
I can't remember exactly.
if you do that, you're fine.
Yeah, well, I mean, thankfully, if you have time, it's better to read the whole book. But in school, you don't always have time to do all of the reading you need to do, and sometimes you have to shortcut it.
Like whenever I'm not in school, like I'll read like monographs and stuff, and like
Just
I can read those and it's fine.
Right.
But, like, and I've even read textbooks, like there was a textbook I had for a class to go for Westerfeld,
Mhm.
I read it the summer after the spring I took her.
I did the same thing.
Great book, but like.
There's a big difference between pleasure reading and reading to get an assignment done. And I wouldn't want you all to think like I need to read every single word of a book. And you just don't need to, especially in history where the professor or the writer.
Political
will-
science, same thing.
Political science is very similar.
Introduction and conclusion is all you need to know.
Monographs are all constructed the same way, particularly in the same, scientific or
Now
the
and
same
now.
A&S discipline. Right. It's an A&S thing almost entirely. But that's my secret, at least. John, what do you got?
So can we have just like,
Some light, yeah, it's a bit dusty in here, isn't it?
No,
we have,
Or something like.
guys, we have like one moment of silence for the 9/11.
Oh, sure, that's a great idea, actually. I don't disagree with that at all. Sure, it's a military history course that we'll talk about that next semester if we get to it. How about a moment of silence? All right, thank you, John. That was a good suggestion. So, shall we continue with our discussion?
British got stomped.
Yes, the British have just been defeated at the battle. Every time I want to say Battle of the Monongahela, banana comes out. I don't know why. The banana of the Monongahela, a classic. It does have, maybe it's because of the banana shape to the battlefield. Maybe, I don't know. What?
The battle of the
yeah.
banana.
I kind of see it. The Battle of the Monongahela is over.
The banana field.
And so now, oh yeah, sorry, so we were continuing with our discussion of the European implications of the 7 Years' War. We had set out who were on each side of the conflict, yes? Do you guys feel okay about continuing with our discussion of the 7 Years' War? So let's continue then to just talk about the first few years of the European side of it. So let's stick with Europe. It's interesting, I had a conversation with Christian about this just the other day, because we were talking a little bit after class about the role of Prussia in the start of the war, right? We talked a little bit about how in the end, it's going to be Maria Theresa who wants revenge. It's going to be the real mover of the alliance system. It's how France and Austria and Russia end up allied against Frederick. But Frederick is going to be the one who starts the war, despite the guy who he can't really gain anything more. The territory of Silesia that I talked about, that he stole from Maria Theresa a few years earlier in the War of Austrian Succession, he can't gain any more from it, frankly. The reason he launches what we end up calling a preemptive strike, this should sound familiar for all of you students of German military history, we'll get into that in just a second, is that feeling of being surrounded. It is a feeling the German military will feel more than once, especially in the next 100 years. Can you guys describe some other wars in which Germany feels surrounded and decides to start shit? World War I, World War II, a couple of other military conflicts. This is going to be a consistent problem, frankly, for the Germans. It's partly geographical, obviously. Occupying the central part of Europe, the cockpit of Europe as it's sometimes called, means that, yes, it can benefit from trade going east and west. Yes, it gets a diffusion of ideas east and west. However, geographically, it will always be exposed to attacks on both sides. And so, Frederick, looking at the military situation of him stuck between France and Austria, with Russia kind of looming as a problem eventually, Russia will have a hard time getting over to Prussia. It's not easy for the Russians to move troops through their own territory, much less into others, means that Frederick thinks the best way for him to deal with the ensuing, or the soon-to-be ensuing war, is to start it himself. And so, in a lot of ways, the 7 Years' War and the French and Indian War, they are linked together, but they're started by different men at different times in different circumstances. We have Dinwiddie in Washington, who start things in the Ohio country. We have Frederick, who starts things in Europe. The reason that they come together as a single war is because of the alliance system that is born out of it almost automatically. Does that make sense? So, Frederick, practicing that very, very Germanic move of the preemptive strike, that's not to tease the Germans, that's simply an acknowledgement that many German military thinkers, Moltke the Elder, Moltke the Younger, and most of the German high command in World War II acknowledged that the only way they could win a war was by quick action, by preventing the other nations they were fighting from gathering their full strength against them. In the end, in World War I, this is why the Germans contemplate the Schlieffen Plan, because they plan on knocking out the French before the Russian steamroller can show up. Frederick's doing the exact same thing. He strikes quickly against the Austrians, hoping to knock them out of the war before the French or the Russians can get going. That's not what happens. In the end, his preemptive strike turns Europe into a battlefield, i.e., most of the next 6 or 7 years for Frederick will be a series of battles in which he is either attacking, defending, or trying to fend off French, Austrian, or Russian incursions. For the first few years of the war, it goes pretty well, generally. For a few years, it goes pretty well. He wins important battles at Soor. He wins important battles at Mollwitz and Kunersdorf. He wins many battles. Part of the reason Frederick is called Frederick the Great is because he is a masterful tactician. One of the few guys on the battlefield that you want on your side. In fact, if for some reason your professor had thought about this and had written up a list of the 25 greatest generals in Western history at some point, he'd probably be in your top 10. Very, very much a brilliant tactician. His problem, as usual, was he, like many of these men who would fall in the top 25, an ego the size of his sun that made it very difficult for him to see his own flaws.
Frederick the Great.
Frederick the Great. So, I want you guys, while we go back to the French and Indian War, because frankly the French and Indian War is more important, obviously, for this class, I want you to keep in mind that Europe at the same time is just a mess of these linear warfare battles, battle after battle, as Prussia tries to essentially hold off what seems to them as an inevitable victory by the continental powers against them. The only way Frederick is able to do this, though, is with the assistance of his ally, the British. The British, however, refuse to commit troops to the continent. The British, again and again, throughout most of British history, are always reluctant to get involved in land wars in Europe. Because why?
They're a naval power.
They're a navy power. One, they're an island. They don't have to get involved in the continental wars if they don't choose to. And two, the British, especially at this point in history, are a naval power. The wooden walls will protect them. The wooden walls of the British ships. We'll talk again and again about the Royal Navy, particularly as it impacts the American Revolution, the War of 1812, a few other things. It's kind of a big deal. So, how then does Britain support their continental ally? The only way the British really can and want to.
Through supplies?
One particular, what we call subsidies. Sometimes these subsidies could reach hundreds of thousands of pounds, I mean cash, kind of the British term for money, pounds, per year. Fredrick could not have survived this war without a massive infusion of money. Fredrick also, and the Prussian army in general, was well noted for the fact that it was the best military in Europe. So he has a couple of, particularly his infantry, he is the best infantry in Europe. Because of this, he's able to escape a lot of battles that his enemies would not be able to escape. Does anybody know how the Prussians became the best military in Europe? Ruthless, rigorous drilling. His men were automatons at an age where being an automaton was a good thing for a foot soldier. They were trained to stand up in these lines and take a punishment of musketry, a punishment of cavalry and artillery fire. The Prussian army, the start of the 7 Years' War, is the finest military in Europe. The problem is, well, I'll let you guys answer. What is the problem with having the finest military in Europe and then putting it through the ringer?
Yeah, it's going to get drained.
Eventually, it'll get worse. And as the war goes on, and we'll talk about this as it impacts the war, eventually Frederick has a hard time filling out his own units. First, he starts by dragooning. Does anybody know that term, dragooning?
No.
Dragooning is when you literally round up randos. He literally dragoons people from different German states into his army. He kidnaps them, for lack of a better term. He spends a lot of time during this war ransacking other German states, not just for money to keep his troops fighting, but also simply for bodies. He is a big fan of using the jail system to put men into his ranks. That is, if you're convicted of literally anything, you can be thrown into the Prussian army. A very different look at the military than what we associate with service. Because again, these are not citizens. They're what? They're subjects. They belong to the king. And the king feels as if, and he is quite right, he can put them in his army and they can die for him. Because he does not give a crap one way or another. He does a lot of recruiting across Europe, more often than not lying to the people he'll be recruiting into the army. However, as you might expect, long term, this isn't good for the Prussian army to keep up its excellence.
So would France be more focused on the war in Europe or the war in North America?
Great question. We'll talk about it. Because does Prussia have any, and let's stick with our words, strategic, operational, tactical. Let's talk about the strategic implications of this war. What is Prussia's strategic goal?
Take out Austria.
Take out Austria. Retain the province that it stole from Maria Theresa earlier. What's France's strategic goal?
Prevent Germany from unifying.
Germany will not unify for another 100, 130 years. You're right. They don't want them to do that, but at the same time, that's not likely at this point. So what is France's strategic goal for this war?
To get Prussia out of certain provinces?
Will they be getting those provinces if they win the war?
Not have them on the border?
So you guys point where Prussia is on the French border?
No, I'm saying, no, they invade other places next to them.
Here's Prussia. Here's Austria. Here's France. What exactly is France going to get out of the strategic situation by helping the Austrians?
Just because they hate them?
It's a big old goose egg. This is one of the questions of European diplomatic history. Why does France even bother to get involved with the Austrians?
Because they can.
Because in the end, it's because they can, frankly. There's a reason that the French and Austrian alliance has a lot of importance for later things. After all, the Austrians end up sending a daughter of the beloved Austrian monarchy to be Queen of France. Her name is Marie Antoinette. This will produce very important results, but at the time, France has almost no incentive to get itself involved in the Continental War. Why then does it do so? We're missing really the one answer.
Prestige?
Prestige is part of it, But no, you guys have all heard the phrase, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. France and Austria become friends because Prussia and Britain are friends. And so in the end, France really shouldn't get itself involved in the land war in Europe, should it? No, where should it be concentrating? The really important area of America, as we've already talked about, the population problems in Canada means they need significant help from the mother country. And the mother country does the opposite of that and it pretty much gets involved in a land war it really needs not get involved in. It's one of the reason it's called diplomatic revolution is because it's a big change in affairs and one that really doesn't make much sense for the French. In fact, the treaty the French signed with the Austrians basically requires them to help Austria if Austria is invaded. It does not provide tangible benefits at all. European diplomacy during these cabinet wars were often much stranger than what we would assume as straightforward strategic thinking, because there were other things involved that we wouldn't necessarily care about as important, particularly as Ryan mentioned, prestige.
Could one of the motivations of the French king just be, I get to be the guy who beat the best army in all of Europe?
Prestige.
You know, yes and no. Generally, the answer is yes. The same European nobles who wanted to fight Fredrick were also quite aware of his reputation. The problem with that is that what we see from the French in this war is they almost never come near Prussia. In the end, all they end up doing is occupying Hanover. Does anybody know what Hanover's connection is to the British?
George?
Yes, the British monarchs of this period are Hanoverian. The current British dynasty descends from a group of Germans called the Hanoverian electorate. So at this time, all of the kings of Britain were also essentially the Dukes of Hanover. And so the Brits had to pay attention to their little slice of Germany, but France could easily occupy it and do whatever they felt like. That's pretty much all they do in this war. Invade and occupy Hanover. And over again, Maria Theresa writes to them saying, "What the bleep are you doing? Come help." And the French are kind of just dicking around in Hanover. So what you get is a France that, yes, has a reason to fight Prussia, but not only doesn't bother to do it particularly well, when they finally do run into Prussia and finally do run into Frederick the Great actually in a battle, they're absolutely defeated and they don't try it again the rest of the war. So in the end, the war comes down to Austria and Russia versus Prussia, which we'll talk about. It still doesn't go well for Prussia.
So what about the other German states?
Mm-hmm. Generally, the big one here, Bavaria, aligns with France. It always aligns with France. Those two are very symbiotic. Saxony, which aligns with Austria, is immediately invaded by Frederick, and he absolutely ruthlessly exploits the Saxons. At one point, he is so lazy about gathering manpower, he literally shoves the Saxon regiments into his line regiments, and they desert during a battle because they don't want to be fighting for him. They literally drop weapons and run off because he didn't bother to intermingle them with Prussian soldiers. So he really cares only about his army. It's really hard for us to understand just how much the Prussian state was dependent on its army surviving.
Was this after the fall of the Holy Roman Empire?
So the Holy Roman Empire still exists at this point. It's still theoretically ruled by a Holy Roman emperor at this point, and here's yet another wrinkle. Does anybody know what family had held the Holy Roman Empire's title almost unbroken for 300 years? The Habsburgs.
Oh, no.
Maria Theresa is a Habsburg.
She doesn't have.
However, Maria Theresa, and this is a big however, Maria Theresa cannot become the Holy Roman Emperor, can she? There's no Holy Roman Empress. So, in one of those weird quirks of fate, for the first time in 300 years, when the German princes get together and elect a Holy Roman Emperor, guess who they pick?
Frederick?
Not Frederick.
Her son?
Not her son. Not her husband, initially. They actually picked the King of Bavaria, who would bribed his way through the election. Eventually, he is required to relinquish the title and hand it over to Maria Theresa's husband, who becomes the Holy Roman Emperor. That is part of the prestige we're talking about. It's a small reason for this fighting, but in the end, it is part of it. And so the Holy Roman Empire will continue its internecine squabbling, is the best way to think of it, through this war, through the Revolutionary Wars. When does the Holy Roman Empire finally fall apart? 18-something is correct. It has a specific year because of thanks to one little Corsican.
Was it at 1872?
1806 is when Napoleon takes a look at the German map and just does a whole bunch of this because he had just annihilated the Prussian army at Jena Auerstadt in 1806. We'll talk about that.
Did the King of Bavaria have a claim to the Habsburg line?
No. So the deal with the Holy Roman Empire is all of the Holy Roman emperors, all of them, were elected. Every single one of them. Each time somebody died, they were always elected. They were not elected by the general populace, obviously. They were elected by 7 men who were called the electors of the Holy Roman Empire. Each one of them, based on the size of the family and their prestige, held this vote. The King of Bavaria was one of them. The Habsburgs were always one of them. And so, however, because the Habsburgs are always the biggest and most important, who was always picked? A Habsburg, over and over and over again. The only time that there's even an interlude is the Bavarian interlude. Does anybody know the family? I'll give you a bonus point if you tell me what family he's from. It's one of the the Bavarian king who becomes Holy Roman Emperor. It's still a very important family. There's lots of them still existent. In fact, the British royal line is connected to them.
Spencer.
Not the Spencers.
Windsor?
Windsors. Starts with a W.
Worcestershire?
That's close.
I don't know.
It's the Wittelsbach family. One of the very big German families. It's the Bavarian family that briefly becomes Holy Roman Emperor, and for a few years later, after the Austrians run over Bavaria, he has to give back his crown. Does that make sense? Does that fit what your question was?
I mean,
Yeah.
Kind of.
that makes sense.
There's a very long explanation of, yes, it's still running. By this point, it's not running at the same style that it
It's
used to
almost
work.
just like a title.
Exactly. It's an empty title, but it's a title with a lot of prestige.
Yeah.
And remember, this is a time and a period where prestige and nobility still plays a huge role in decision making. The officers of these people are are almost always aristocrats as much as they are citizens.
So their titles are about as empty as being an admin on Reddit?
Yes and no. I will say the Holy Roman Emperor as a title, going all the way back to the very first Holy Roman Empire, meant almost nothing as a title. It's what you could do with the power of the land you controlled directly
Well, yeah.
that made you powerful.
Yeah.
The most powerful of the Holy Roman Emperors were who? I mean, there's pretty much 2.
Charlemagne.
Sure.
And don't count him. He's the primogeniture. He didn't count. You're correct. Charlemagne, but he's not what we would consider a Holy Roman Emperor in terms of the German distinction. There's only 2 powerful Germans, and both of them are dead before 1300. Here's one of their namesakes, Fredrick II, the great one, who lived in Sicily for most of his life, and his red-bearded pal. A German military operation is named after him.
Blitz?
When the Germans invade Russia, what do they call that? Barbarossa, Redbeard. Emperor Frederick Barbarossa, who died on the Third Crusade, is the other powerful Holy Roman Emperor. Other than that, the rest of them are various levels of whatever. The German Holy Roman Emperor is much, much more, to quote Voltaire, again, I quote him a lot, the Holy Roman Empire is neither holy, nor Roman, nor an empire. It's a bunch of German states masquerading as what used to be a bunch of Roman rules and laws. Make more sense that way?
Yeah.
It's a very, I'm seeing that, you want me to explain further?
No, I just got it when you said that.
Yeah, it kind of just springs into like, Voltaire sums up a lot of things very well for us. It's very easy just to remember Voltaire. So does that make up, does that answer where we're at on the 7 Years' War in Europe? We will come back to it in a couple of years once things fall apart for Frederick, okay? So,
Fred.
old Fred. So let's move back to the French and Indian War. And let's break up the French and Indian War into 2 phases so that you guys can remember it better. We'll have the first one, which runs from our buddy's failure through about 1758, 59. During the first 4 or 5 years, as you guys can see from the title here, New France is very much in the driver's seat. And when I say that, what I mean is the French, particularly the colonial French, have a much better idea of the war. They have a much better strategic grasp of the situation, and they frankly fight it much better than the English. So let's talk about it. As you guys already know, we've talked about this guy before. This is the Governor General of Canada. Who is this? We mentioned him before. The Marquis de B. This is the Marquis de Vaudreuil. This is the guy who was already running things. The Marquis, I'm just going to write the Marquis of the Marquis de Vaudreuil, so you remember him, is the Captain General of the French Canadian Forces. He begins getting reinforcements from Europe because the French are just as aware as the English that there's going to take some sort of initiative from the continent.
This is Marquis of what?
Vaudreuil.
Vaudreuil?
Vaudreuil.
What?
V-A-U, Vaud, D-R-E-U-I-L, Vaudreuil. It's French.
I just thought that you just.
I'm sorry, I'm going to stick with the French pronunciations as much as possible. The M, you've had enough of it. I'm going to let you do the French pronunciations from here on out. Now you've done it. So, the Marquis de Vaudreuil begins getting reinforcements from the continent. Now, the problem is, it's much, much more of a trickle. It's a trickle of regulars for a couple reasons. One, what is the reason I said is going to be the consistent problem with Canada and keeping a high population?
Very, very big.
It's big, and it is not very, it's not as hospitable as the English colonies. There's simply not enough food production. So, if you're the French government and you send out tens of thousands of French regulars, what's probably going to happen to them? They're going to starve, or their presence is going to starve who? The Canadians, the natives, all the other groups that rely on New France. They simply cannot handle a huge influx of troops. That's the big reason why the French will remain always outnumbered by the British during this war. The second one, think hard about what we just said. Why is it that only a trickle of French reinforcements reach Canada?
Because of the British naval.
There it is, the Royal Navy. The French Navy, such as it is, has not won a battle against the British Navy in about 40, 50 years. It will not win a battle against the British except for one in nearly 150 years. There is nothing quite like the, how to put it? You ever watched a baseball game or a basketball game or a football game and you've watched one side clearly outclass the other? I got it. Globetrotters versus the Washington Generals or whatever the hell their name is. You know, and they're like doing behind the back passes and dunking and crazy shit like that, and the other team's like hapless and falling over.
That would be the 1980s hockey game between the Soviets and the.
No, that one's an upset. We're not talking about an upset here. We're talking about David versus Goliath, but Goliath keeps smacking the crap out of David is the problem.
Well, yeah.
The British Navy goes on what we would consider a winning streak of all winning streaks, starting about 1700 and ending at about, well, never technically. They really just wail on the French at every major naval engagement. You can name it if you want. How many of you all know the big battles in which the British beat the shit out of the French Navy? You can come up with one for me, right? None? Not a single battle?
Bro, I took a British history class. I can't think of one.
Did you think the French beat the British?
No, just one time where the British beat the French. One naval battle, the British, and there's lots of them. They wail on them almost constantly. All right, I'm gonna start naming them. You tell me when you hear one you know. Cape Finisterre.
No.
The Glorious 1st of June.
No.
Trafalgar.
Yeah.
The Nile.
Yeah, a little bit.
We're getting there, yeah. Over and over again,
Square.
the British are just better at this than their French
Because
counterparts.
they're an island, they had to do it.
Here's the big reason. There's been a billion words spilled by historians on why the British always wailed on them. In the end, it's because they had a much larger navy. They had a much larger reason to have a navy, and they were also merchants, which meant they were trading and sailing constantly. The French just never could compete with them. What's important about this is that because of the Royal Navy, what does the Royal Navy immediately do to Canada? It institutes a blockade. Very good. If you were talking about our three words, strategic, operational, tactical, A blockade is which one of those when you're conducting a military campaign?
Basically just a wall of
Operation.
Which one of those three?
Tactic?
Strategic. It's a strategic decision. How you position them is operational. How you conduct the different squads of the blockade, and then if the ships come in and fight each other, that's tactical. But a strategic blockade, can any of you all name a much more important strategic blockade in American history? We're going to talk about during the Civil War. No, not that one.
The Gulf.
The Anaconda, very good, very good. The Anaconda, same thing, that's great. Remember, you guys, I'm sure, have been exposed to the concept of the Anaconda Plan, by which Lincoln choked off the Confederacy with a blockade. That was a strategic decision between him and his military leadership. How it was conducted, that's up to the military generally, but it was a strategic formulation. This is a strategic blockade. Make sense? It prevents the French from not only receiving troops. What are other things that are not going to get through the blockade? Supplies, particularly what supply? Not food. Guns and gunpowder. And remember, at a time where gunpowder is a big part of shooting a gun, large quantities are required to keep things running. The British can produce gunpowder in the New World. They also have a navy that can bring in lots of it if need be. The French, conversely, cannot and do not. And to stick with this point, what system that the French provide and the French stick with their entire reason for Canada existing, what relies on them continuing to receive guns and gunpowder? Bingo. Very good. Remember we talked about gift giving? The natives will eventually abandon the French if the French can't do what? Keep giving them gifts. Eventually their alliances will break down. The blockade is a big, big problem. But, here's the but it will not affect them for a few years, essentially, because they continue to get some ships through, and more to the point, the French realized almost as soon as things kicked off, they sent as much as they could immediately. So they were able to kind of squirrel it away for a few years, particularly because they're able to get a few troop transports through to provide kind of the core of the French elite troops in the New World. However, and here's another one of those howevers, there is a debate between the Captain General of France and the new leader of the French army sent out by France. This man is much more famous than Vaudreuil. This is the Marquis de Montcalm. That should be a name that should ring some bells for a couple of you. Yeah, John's got it. The Marquis de Montcalm is a very famous French general. He is sent out from France. And as you might expect, he is sent from France and comes with all of those French aristocratic ideas and notions. He has never set foot in the New World. Vaudreuil, on the contrary, is not only born in the New World as a French administrator, but has been there for 20, 25 years. And Vaudreuil understands much more clearly than Montcalm about the importance of what? The natives. Very good. He understands way better the need for the natives than Montcalm does.
Did the European French have the same ideas about the colonial French that the English had about?
Bingo. The same problems and infighting will be present here, but on a smaller scale because there's less of them.
How do you spell that news name?
It's up here. Oh, minis.
Can't see that. It's like size 2 font.
I made this thing so big, and I thought that things would be bigger, and they're just not.
No.
Montcalm. Montcalm.
Oh, okay.
M-O.
Okay, that's actually spelled how it sounds.
It is Montcalm.
Sounds like a very peaceful mountain.
My spelling and my writing are both bad, so call me out as much as you can, and I'll correct it.
Yeah,
So-
and when you wrote preemptive, it looks like distinctive.
Yeah, it's just bad. It's just really bad. Nobody has ever corrected me, and I refuse to be corrected, so it'll continue that
It
way.
looks like people.
I wonder why no one's corrected you.
Because I'm a boss. That's how being a professor works. So, let's
You
continue.
can say that.
Do not question.
Don't question me.
Do not question the
Do
element.
not question me. So, let's talk about it. The French strategic overview is much more simple than the British one, right? Let's talk about the strategic implications of the war. What are the French trying to do? We're not talking about winning. What is the way in which they want to win? Or how can they win?
British away from Ohio country.
Do they need to?
Well, Not really.
After all, the French beat the British in the opening battles. Now, all they need to do is what? Survive. For the French, the strategy is pretty simple. It's one of survival. They simply need to prevent the British from taking over New France long enough for Britain to do what? Get tired and pack it in. That's exactly what had happened in the War of Austrian Succession. It's exactly what had happened in the War of Spanish Succession. Eventually, Britain will get distracted elsewhere, particularly in Europe or in the Caribbean, and simply say, I've had enough. So, for the French, it's much easier for them to sit back. They have a smaller resource pool, they have a smaller amount of men. Does that strategy fit with their ability to enact it?
Right, yeah.
Yeah, you can't take big offenses if you don't have any men, right? It's a pretty simple dictum.
Wave 3 incoming, you know.
Right. If you've only got one wave, you really can't play up a big battle scene
Like
that
a
way.
wave shooter, you survive.
Survive.
Yeah,
So
as much resources as you can, drive them away, hope you live.
exactly. So you just keep holding them off.
Yeah.
That's the French conception. What's the British conception then? If this is a war of survival for the French, it becomes a war of
Attrition?
conquest for the British. The British have specific territorial aims they want, particularly the Ohio country. And so for them, the best way to make sure that they get the Ohio country is not only to conquer the Ohio country, but what else? Annihilate the French. There's a good reason the British initially think that the best way to defeat the French isn't initially through the Ohio country. That's not where their first invasions are post Battle of the Monongahela. In fact, the first one we're going to talk about, and probably the most devastating of them, takes place far closer. Where are we? Let's talk about the hideous battle. It's often called the Battle of Fort Carillon. Carillon is at a place that you guys have probably heard of before in New York. It is, without a doubt, one of the most important strategic areas in the Western, or in the New World at this point. Eventually, the British will take this fort years later and rename it. You'll know this name much better. Does anybody know what this fort's called? It's a very, very famous fort from the American Revolution as well. Oh.
Fort George.
No.
Ticonderoga.
Ticonderoga, very good round. This is eventually renamed the Fort Ticonderoga.
That's where I was thinking, like the mouth of the river.
Champlain, very good, very good.
Yeah.
Very good. Fort Carillon and the Battle of Fort Carillon is a very good avatar for how the first few years go. So, to remember, we're in phase one. Phase one, then, is France winning. It's a pretty easy way to sum up the first few years. Most of the French strategy revolved around, as you might expect in a war of survival or one in defense, they consider it an active defense. And so most of it is raiding. Native troops alongside French militia burn up and down what location? All over the frontier. Every isolated farmstead, every house, every woman and child in the British backcountry is what to them?
An enemy?
An enemy.
Target.
And given the way the natives had fought for many years, the French simply follow them into this. They burn hundreds of homes, thousands and thousands worth of British pounds, and many American colonists living on the frontier have to go where?
Back to the,
They flee back to the more secure locations. In fact, at one point, in an almost insane moment for the British, smoke clouds can be seen from the outskirts of Philadelphia, which 100 years before may have been the frontier, but by this point was not considered as such. So very much, the French bring the war home to the British, but they don't have the overwhelming military superiority to do anything more than that, right?
You know, actually, like when you like see in like apocalypse movies, like you're in like the woods on the hills, seeing like a major city, you see fires and smoke pillars and sirens wailing in the distance. That's basically what was happening there. You know?
Pretty much, it's a good avatar for it. Essentially, what we're talking about here is these homes are being burned. People living in them killed if they didn't escape fast enough. And so what that did was, one, it made them fearful that the British Empire couldn't secure their own borders. And two, it made it much more obvious that the French and the natives, their strategy of fighting what's essentially a very, very cheap version of the war is successful, right? If you can prevent the British from having to do anything other than defend a bunch of isolated farmsteads, have you prevented them from mounting a major expedition to destroy you? Sure. Christian.
So would that like mobilize the colonists though? Like,
Yes, it very much would. That's the backside of this strategy, is that if you declare war on the British Empire, do you want the American colonists to get into it? No, for the most part, you'd prefer them to lie dormant. What was the previous relationship between American colonists and French colonists before the war kicks up?
economic?
Trade partners, generally. So many Americans don't want to disturb that. In fact, that'll be one of the most hideous problems in the War of 1812, is that there are literally American citizens selling beef to starving British soldiers during the War of 1812. Trade links like that are hard to upset even during a war. Something like this, though, will do what?
Yeah, it's got
It inflames the American frontier population. That much is clear. But
in flames.
inflames, pun not intended. But the important part of this is, this doesn't really do anything to hamper the British ability to fight this war, right? It doesn't impact the British Army, it doesn't impact the British Navy. Sure, it may require that the British spread more troops on the frontier, but again, are the British putting any troops into Europe?
No.
The British have almost an entire ability to decide how and when they want to continue fighting this war. And so the first major battle then we'll talk about is their attempt to take the big French fort at Carillon, one of the most important strategic centers of the war in what is modern New York. Carillon is a big fort in the same style as old European forts. It is a rock. In fact, it's nicknamed by most American observers the Gibraltar of the West. That's a reference to what? Yes, the Strait of Gibraltar, which is held and was and is probably one of the most important strategic points in the entire world history. The British held Gibraltar as a fortress for hundreds of years. They still do. So when I say that it's an important defensive spot, I mean it. It's the key to the West in a lot of ways. So the French, under, at this point, Montcalm, plan on fighting a defensive battle. They cannot lose Carillon, in their opinion. This one is one of those quirky battles because it should not have happened the way it did. And again, the French are outnumbered. This time, the British invasion is much larger. We're talking here at Carillon about an army that's probably something in the neighborhood of 16 or 17,000 men. The British assemble a big force to take this.
Is that Abercrombie now?
This is Abercrombie. Very good. Very good. Abercrombie takes a huge army, about 16,000 men, to besiege Carillon. Now, we think Montcalm may have had something in the neighborhood of 6,000 to 7,000 men. Again, we talk a lot about the discrepancy in numbers between the French and the British because it's a very real problem. However, in one of those battles that often defines credulity, what you get, I'll draw this out for you so you can actually see this, the Star Fort of Carillon with a bunch of defenses built into the ground. You can actually see them here. You see the fort line here,
Oh, yeah.
and you see these wood chop things with sharp stakes. Does anybody know what those are called? When you put some wood in to make it stick into people in front of a fortification to trip them up and slow them down. It's called an abatis.
Oh, sort of like monkey sticks or something?
Yep, pointy stakes is a better way to sum it. A-B-A-T-I-S, an abatis. The French build one of these in front of the fort and think there's no freaking way Abercrombie attacks us straight on. At the time, there's only 3 ways to take a city or take a fort or of any kind in Europe or in the New World. They're what?
Starve them out,
Starve them out,
bomb them out,
bomb them out.
or
You're close. What's your last option? You either starve them until they surrender, you bombard them until they have no choice but to give up, or you assault the walls straight up with infantry. Guess which dumb move Abercrombie picks?
Assault the walls?
Yep, line assault. He lines up his troops into his big, long, beautiful lines the British are so fond of, and they head-on attack.
And who did this?
This is Abercrombie and the British attacking Montcalm and his troops at Fort Carillon. You can actually see from this picture, you can see what Nevada's does to a line once you get into it. The men who aren't impaled trying to get through it are what? Sitting ducks as they're shot down in heaps.
It's no man's
Did
land.
he not have the artillery?
He did. He fired it for a while and then said, up you go. This is the problem with that style of warfare is these aristocratic officers believed their men could conquer anything as long as they were brave enough. That's stupid, right? That's tactical stupidity, but it fit with the time. It certainly fit with Abercrombie's style of fighting the French, and he believed his elite units, particularly one of the most famous units in the army, the Black Watch, one of the great Highland units of Scottish troops, would simply break through. There's a very famous story, I'll tell you, a very famous legend about this battle. One of the commanders of the Scottish Highland Regiment was back in Scotland a few years before the battle, and he gave one stormy night in Scotland during a stormy night. I can do a Scottish accent. I'll do it with a Scottish accent. It's raining, and it's thundering, and the wind is coming in, and this man, he has a knock on his door. I don't even know where this accent is
He
going.
opens his door.
It's going to be like a Sean Connery in about 5 minutes. So he hears a knock on his door, and this guy is bedraggled, totally soaked to the bone. And the guy comes in, he's like, can you please hide me? I've done something terrible. Can you hide me in my house? Or in your house? And the Scottish noble says, sure. So he takes him into the house, and you guys all know how hospitality works in the old world. You cannot break hospitality. Once they've broken bread, once they've had water, they're sacred man. It's a very old thing, goes all the way back to the very beginning of human civilization.
Yeah.
Ignoring them. He brings the guy in, the guy tells him the story. By the end of the story, he realizes the guy had murdered his own brother. So whoops. So he tells the guy he can't kill him because of this concept. You can't kill somebody you've given hospitality to, but the guy can't stay any longer. And so he tells him he has to go hide in a cave on his property. And while on the way to this cave, he meets a stranger on the road who says, beware Ticonderoga, a word he has never heard before, nor has ever been uttered, obviously, in Scotland.
What the hell?
The guy says, whatever, who gives a shit, I don't know what you're talking about, and the story moves on. A few years later, he and his men are in front of a place the natives call Ticonderoga. Guess what happens to this Scottish officer?
He gets killed?
Catches a bullet and dies. It's a Scottish legend that actually dates from this period because of the connection of the Scot who was both present at that murder, who found his brother's murderer, and because he was killed at Ticonderoga.
Like a time traveler or something?
It's a legend.
It's
I mean,
just like-
it's obviously, it's a legend.
It's just
There's no
like-
veracity to it,
It's
but.
just like talking to a German soldier, be careful with Normandy.
Yeah, exactly. It's not something that's actually true. It's a
Yeah.
legend, but it's one of those Scottish Highland legends I always like telling.
Did they become the Queen Rangers in the Revolutionary War?
No. This is the Black Watch, the 42nd Scott Regiment. This is an old regiment that dates well before this. The Queen's Rangers are a different unit entirely. Queen's Rangers are exclusively recruited in the New World.
You talk us that kills.
Yes, you can actually see these are Scottish troops by their kilts. I mean, these are nationality-based troops.
Yep.
Quite literally, these troops go in lines with bagpipes playing and their skirts swirling. I mean, there's no armor, there's no nothing. That's your battlefield equipment. And they died in droves. The Battle of Carillon is a crushing British defeat. Importantly for our strategic implications in this war, for how we consider the war, this battle is almost entirely won by the French because of their regulars, who keep up a regular fire, but more to the point, who wins this battle? Who loses it? Is this anything the French did? Did they do anything particularly difficult?
No, that
Just shoot down the guys who are sitting ducks in front of you. Montcalm, the commander, takes the wrong lesson from this battle. He takes the lesson that French regulars can go toe-to-toe with British regulars, and who needs to not be involved? The natives. Montcalm uses this battle to confirm his already clear distaste of the natives. And this is going to be a problem, because Vaudreuil keeps telling him what? You gotta have them. You cannot have a new France that survives if you tell the natives to screw off. or if you misuse them, or if you abuse them. They are very, they believe, and they obviously for good reason, they see themselves as allies of the French, not as subjects. You cannot tell them what to do. They have to do it willingly. And so when we come back on Monday and we talk about the Battle of Fort William Henry, we'll see just how much of a failure Montcalm makes of his need to hold on to his native troops. Questions or concerns? Good chat today, guys. I'll see you on Monday.
You know, this actually has a nice parallel to D-Day. I mean, they have like the stake things